How can you believe in God when there is so much evil and
People
suffering?
who never heard the gospel.
Christianity and science opposed.
Why are Christians
What does God
so
have to do with
hypocritical?
our
Isn't
sexuality?
Christianity just
Really
blind
believe
faith?
God is real?
Why do we believe the Bible
Does
is
prayer
not
even work?
inclusive of
Jesus
other
rose
faiths
from the dead.
Why are Christians so political?
How can you believe in God when there is so much evil and suffering?
Well, good evening, everybody. So tonight you get a special treat. So this is Clay Myatt. He grew up in the area, went off to school at Vanderbilt, and he's just finishing his Master of Divinity at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And then next week, are you moving to Florida? Is that the story?
About a month.
About a month, okay. So in about a month, he's taking a position at a church in Florida. So I asked him if we could team develop this sermon on the problem of evil. And we worked for a couple weeks together, and it's been really a privilege to work together. It's been really fun. And so he's going to be teaching tonight. After the message, we're actually going to partner up and do a Q&A. So you'll see the text-in number on the screen. So if you text any questions you have about the topic today, we would love to tackle that together. So if you'd welcome Clay this evening.
Thanks, Josh. So on the day after Christmas in 2004, as some of you guys might remember, an earthquake happened out over the Indian Ocean, and it led to this massive tsunami that hit the southern coast of countries in Asia and the eastern coast of countries in Africa. And David Bentley Hart, writing in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks afterwards, writes this: "In the days immediately following, a proper picture of the real dimension of the disaster was strangely slow in reaching the world beyond. At first, those of us who lived far from the region heard that thousands had perished, which seemed tragic enough. Then in subsequent days, the number of the dead began to be reckoned in tens of thousands, and then finally in hundreds of thousands, and the true horror of what had occurred became in some small measure appreciable for us. As I write, the most recent estimate is very near 250,000. And when images of the aftermath began to appear, they seemed too dreadful to believe. Films of those caught amid the flood, clinging desperately to poles and railings, and occasionally losing their grip to be torn away by the fierce rush of the water. Satellite pictures showing where whole islands had been laid waste, villages swept away, the earth stripped of vegetation, and photographs of long stretches of coastline strewn not only with wreckage, but with countless corpses, a great many the corpses of small children." And like I said, I'm sure a lot of you guys remember that event in 2004. And it's because of events like this that we have what scholars have called the problem of evil and suffering. You know, if God is all good, if God is all powerful, couldn't he have done something to prevent these kinds of evils? And so this is the next question we're dealing with in this, our big question series, the problem of evil and suffering. And in short, the problem of evil can be summarized like this: if God is perfectly good, then he must want to abolish all evil. If God is unlimitedly powerful, then he must be able to abolish all evil. Therefore, God is not perfectly good, or he is not unlimitedly powerful, or God simply does not exist. And historically, this problem has been divided into kind of two components. And so the first is the more philosophical component, okay? This is the problem for the intellectual, the more dispassionate scholar, kind of standing on the outside of the suffering, looking in, debating, okay, what does this say about the existence of God? And this philosophical problem we could probably summarize in 6 statements. So if point 1 would be God exists, point 2, God is all-powerful, point 3, God is all-knowing, point 4, God is all good, point 5, God created the world. And if those first 5 points are true, then the argument goes the 6th one cannot logically be true, that the world contains evil. And this problem has a lot of history to it. Epicurus, even in 300 BC, was talking about it. And over the last 2,000 years, it's been kind of reformulated in various ways. However, there was a pretty crucial moment in kind of the history of this problem in 1974 when Alvin Plantinga, a philosopher, wrote a book called God, Freedom, and Evil. And in this book, he sought to kind of disprove this notion that evil, the existence of evil, disproves the existence of God. And so what he did is he said, there's this implicit assumption that people have, that scholars are having when they talk about this problem of evil, and that implicit assumption is that an all-good God would want to eliminate all evil. And so what he said was, what if God maybe has a good reason that we don't know about and for allowing evil? And so he has this really interesting illustration. He said, okay, what if pretend you were camping and you're out, going up to your tent. If you open the door of your tent and look inside, you could logically say there are no St. Bernards inside my tent. St. Bernard's a big animal. If I open my tent, I don't see any St. Bernards. I am in good grounds to say there are no St. Bernards inside my tent. However, if I said there are no what he called no-see-ums, or those little bugs that'll bite you, if I go and open my tent and say there's no no-see-ums inside my tent, I would be not on very good grounds to say that because you can hardly see these things when they're a few inches away from you. So how do I know there's not any somewhere else inside of my tent? And so this is the argument that he used, and he said, how do we know, what if God actually has good reasons for allowing evil to happen, kind of like these no-see-ums? And so he came up with, it's a longer statement, but these are his response in 3 statements. An all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God who created the world exists. Point 2, God created a world in which evil emerged, and God has a good reason for doing so. And then point 3, therefore, the world contains evil. And so ever since 1974, the argument's been a little different. Since 1974, no one has made the argument that evil, the existence of evil, disproves the existence of God. The argument has shifted a little bit. Now, when people debate this, they'll say, is the existence of evil evidence against God, or is there evidence for God? And so this is where the problem is now. And we don't have time to kind of delve into these things. But let me just say that no matter what your worldview is, you could be of any religion, any worldview, the problem of evil and suffering is a problem that we all have to reckon with. No worldview provides, in my opinion, wholly satisfactory answers, Christianity included. We don't get all of our questions answered, but I do find the Christian worldview to be the most compelling, although we can't say more about that now. But that's the first problem. It's the more philosophical problem. The second half of this problem of evil is the more personal or the more pastoral problem of evil. And so this is for the person who's in the fire themselves. It's for the person who's suffering. It's when all that global suffering, when it comes home, the response from this person is more emotional, it's more visceral. It's like it's the experience of being in the fire. And so this is the problem that we're going to be talking about for 2 reasons. One is it's the one that the Bible deals a lot more heavily with. The Bible deals a lot more heavily with, okay, how do we respond to the evil and suffering that's in the world? And then secondly, this is the problem that tends to rock people's boats more. This is the one that turns people's lives upside down. It's the one that we need to know how to respond to. Now, before we get into Psalm 22, I just want to make a brief note, because in a room this size, I'm sure there's some of you here for whom the problem of evil isn't really a problem at all. It doesn't keep you awake at night. You have answers that will satisfy you, theologically or intellectually, and that's okay. But let me say that that's where I was personally a few years ago. The problem of evil and suffering wasn't a major problem for me. And then I started dealing with some health issues, and then it really did become a problem. It was something that I really wrestled with. So if you're here and the problem of evil is not really a problem for you, I'd still encourage you to listen and hear what Psalm 22 has to say, because who knows, maybe one day it will become a problem for you. So Psalm 22 tells us that God alone has the answer to the question of suffering and evil, but it gives us a pathway to respond. So God alone has the answer to the question of evil and suffering, but Psalm 22 is going to lay out a response for us. As Brian mentioned, Psalm 22 is a psalm of David, and David is writing this psalm while he's in distress. We don't know anything else about it other than that. But it gives us this response for how and it models a response for how we can respond to the problem of evil and suffering. And so the first thing it tells us, or the first thing it models for us, is to look up. And by this I mean pour out your heart honestly before God. As Brian read it, and the first few verses, this probably sounded a lot like complaining. And so I'll reread verses 1 and 2. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. This Psalm 22 sounds a lot like complaining, and that's because it is complaining. It is complaining, but it's complaining to God. That's the key thing to keep in mind. It's not complaining to your friend, although maybe there's place for that. It's not complaining to the world, on social media. I'm not sure if there's a place for that, but it's complaining to God. That's what marks Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is really part of this larger genre of psalms called the lament psalms. And so the lament psalms actually make up the largest portion of the book of Psalms, more than the praise or the thanksgiving psalms. And these are laments or complaints to God. And I think they really give us kind of this middle ground for responding to evil and suffering between two extremes that we often find in the church. So on one extreme, maybe is a more traditional view where emotions are irrelevant, emotions are unimportant, emotions are a sign of weakness. Maybe the motto here is, suck it up. And then, so it's not that, but it's also not a more maybe contemporary view that views emotions as ultimate, emotions as all important, emotions as what defines my reality. Emotions can't be critiqued at all. The most important thing is to express emotion. And so these lament psalms are kind of halfway in between. Against the more traditional view, they say emotions are important. They're important. It's important to express them. But against this view, it says expressing them isn't the only thing that matters. The thing that matters is expressing them to God, and it's only in expressing them to God that we begin to grow and to develop because of whatever this suffering or evil in our lives are. I remember being in college and reading some of these Psalms of Lament and even the book of Job and wondering, are we really supposed to pray like this? And the answer, though, it has to be yes. I mean, the book of Psalms is kind of the inspired prayer book of the church. It's meant to model for us how we pray to God, how we bring all of our different life circumstances to God. So we can, not only we can pray this way, but we really should pray this way. So the question to ask yourself is, where do you turn when suffering and evil comes your way? When you don't get into the college that you really wanted to get into, or when your boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you, where do you turn? Who's the first person you turn to? The first person you turn to says a lot about who you are trusting, and Psalm 22 is urging us to make that person God. So that's the first thing David does here, is he looks up to God, he pours out his heart to God when he experiences suffering and evil. And then the second thing he does is he looks back. So after looking up, he looks back. And so verses 3-5, he says, "Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame." So here David's looking back on the history of Israel. He's seeing how God delivered them across the Red Sea, how God sustained the people of Israel in the wilderness. And so he's looking back on all of his spiritual ancestors. But if you think about it, we have a lot more spiritual ancestors than David did. Not only do we have the rest of the Old Testament saints, but we have all of the New Testament saints and believers. We have 2,000 years of church history of people to look back on to see how God has been faithful in their lives. And we have each other. We have each other. We have those believers who are alive with us even now. And so the application here is, do you spend time regularly with other Christian believers in a small group or in a life group, a Bible study, hearing and being encouraged by their stories? There's really something to be said for how encouraging it can be to see how God has been tangibly faithful in another person's life when maybe in your own life in recent times you haven't seen how faithful he's been. And that can be a real encouragement to our faith. So are you in some sort? Are you in some sort of life group? Do you gather with other Christian believers? But he doesn't just look back on his spiritual ancestors, he also looks back on his own life. So verses 9 and 10, he says, "Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God." And so here David looks back at his very birth and sees how God has been faithful to him all along and has sustained his very life. So how about you? Do you reflect on where God has brought you? Do you have any sort of journaling practice in your life? Do you reflect on how God has sustained you? We all have stories about how God has brought us through moments in our life that maybe in the moment we never thought that we would get through them. But if we do mark those things down, then when we get to something else in our life, that again we're like, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to get through this? We can then look back and say, oh yeah, God was faithful and sustained me the first time around. He will sustain me and bring me through this time around. So that's the second thing David does. First he looks up, then he looks back. And all of this looking up and looking back actually creates kind of a transition in David's prayer. So verse 19 here, he says, "But you, O Lord, do not be far off. O you, my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion." And then here's the key turn. "You have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen." And so that word rescued in the original Hebrew, it probably has it in your Bibles, is actually the word answered. And so there's no indication here that David's circumstances have changed at all. But what has changed is that he has a new perspective. He has a new perspective. He knows that he's been answered by God, and that enables him to look ahead. So the final way that that Psalm 22 models for us how to respond to evil and suffering is to look ahead. And he goes into verse 22. He says, "I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you." And so here David's looking ahead to this future deliverance. He's confident that he will again praise God. And he's confident that he will again praise God because he knows that there is no permanent darkness. So whatever circumstance is going on in your life, whatever evil and suffering you face, one thing you can take away from here is David saying there is no permanent darkness. He's looking ahead to this future deliverance. He still, like I said, he still has the same circumstances. There's not really an indication that his circumstances have changed, but after looking up to God and pouring out his heart to God and looking back to see how God has been faithful, he's able to look ahead now and have confidence that one day God will deliver him, even if he hasn't delivered him now. And I'm going to read verses 27 to 31 here. But note how this is a very lofty vision that David's laying out here. That's something that never would have happened to him. So verse 27, he says, "All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn. that he has done it. And so David's looking ahead to this final feast, this final place where all the nations and all generations are going to come together and worship God. But this is something that never would have happened in David's life. It's something that he is looking ahead to by faith that is really laid out more explicitly at the end of the Bible in Revelation. But this actually isn't the first time that David is speaking about something that actually hasn't happened to him, or that didn't physically happen to him, that he was speaking about more figuratively. And some of these figurative things that David spoke about actually were fulfilled literally in Jesus. And so really this whole Psalm 22 is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. So look with me at some of these verses. Jesus' heart melted like wax in the Garden of Gethsemane. Verse 14, Jesus had people wag their heads at him and mock him. Verses 7 and 8. Jesus experienced great dehydration on the cross, and he cried out, "I thirst." Verse 15, Jesus literally had his hands and his feet pierced as he was crucified. Verse 16, Jesus' bones were literally on display as he's being executed. Verse 17, Jesus' garments were gambled for. Verse 18, and Jesus was ultimately forsaken by God. Verse 1, whereas David merely felt that he had been forsaken by God, Jesus not only felt that he was forsaken by God, but was actually forsaken by God on the cross. And so in Jesus then, God enters into and experiences suffering and evil. In Jesus, God enters into and experiences suffering and evil. And so this million-dollar question that everyone wants to know is, why does God, if he's all good and all powerful, why does he allow suffering and evil in my life? And as I've made clear, the Bible does not give us a firm answer to that. The Bible doesn't give us a clear answer as to exactly the reasons why God does these things. But what we can say is one reason that it's not. We can say that one of the reasons that it's not is that God doesn't love us, or that God has abandoned us. And that's because when we look to see how much he sacrificed for us then, if he was willing to sacrifice so much for us then, how can he not be with us now? I mentioned kind of my experience at the beginning of kind of wrestling with the problem of evil and dealing with health issues. And it's this truth that I've actually found to be the most helpful as I've walked through suffering and evil. And the reason for that is because what it means is that even if I don't get all my answers, all my questions answered as to why God allows suffering and evil, I know that God hasn't forsaken me. And I know that God's not asking me to walk through anything that he hasn't walked through first. And so if you're personally walking through suffering and evil right now, this might be the most practical truth that you can remember and hang on to. In a room this big, I'm sure there are some of you who feel abandoned by God. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe you've been dealing with health issues. Maybe you dealt with the loss of a loved one, and you're asking the question, my God, why have you forsaken me? And this psalm doesn't give us a clear answer to that, but what it does say is one of the answers can't be that God has abandoned you. One of the answers can't be that God has forsaken you. One of the answers can't be that God doesn't love you, because he showed how much he loves you when he went to the cross for you, to suffer a brutal execution, to enter into a broken world, and ultimately to be cut off from his Father on your behalf. And so we can take heart from that. And not only when he enters into our suffering, and not only can we take heart from it and know that he's with us, when he enters into our suffering, he redeems us. And so this feast that's talked about here in Psalm 22 that's to come, of all nations and all peoples, it's talked about in Revelation 19 to 22. And when the Bible speaks of this lays out this future vision for us and how great it is, how great our hope is, the reason it does that is to help us walk through and face suffering and evil now. We don't get to it until the very end, but all this vision is laid out for us now, so that even now we can have hope as we face this suffering and evil. And I know no other, outside of the Bible, outside of Revelation 21:22, I don't know of another person who's put it more beautifully than Fyodor Dostoevsky did. He was a Russian novelist in the 1800s. He's spent a lot of time in prison as a political prisoner in Russia, and they didn't mess around, so he went through some stuff that we could probably never even, would imagine. But this is what he said in one of his books. He said, "I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, for all the blood that they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened." And what he's talking about there, that something so precious to come that will justify everything, or make it possible to forgive and even justify all that's happened, that is the new creation. That's the new heavens and the new earth that's coming. And so I encourage you, if you by way of application, maybe if you've never read, or if you don't know what our hope is, or if you've never read Revelation 21 and 22, I encourage you to read that this week. This new creation that is talked about means that not only do we get a consolation prize for the life we lost here, but we actually get the restoration of the life we've always wanted, to dwell with God and to worship him and to dwell with his people in a new heavens and a new earth, where death is no more, neither crying nor mourning nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And so all this looking up, looking back, and looking ahead has to be added onto with the coming of Jesus. Now, when we look up to God, we look up to a God who understands. We look up to a God who's been there, and he can relate to us. He can empathize with us. When we look back, we look at the moment when God entered into and experienced suffering on our behalf. And when we look ahead, we look forward to the day when suffering has been redeemed, where suffering is no more, and where death is no more. So some of you may be sitting here still skeptical, wondering, all right, why doesn't God, I get all this about what our response is, but why doesn't God actually do something about all the evil in the world? But another question that we have to ask is, what about the evil that we have done? What about the evil that you've done? What about the evil I've done? A lot of times when these conversations of problem of suffering and evil come up, this isn't brought up usually, but I think if you reflect on your life, you'd have to say there have been times that you've been the victim of suffering and evil, but there's also been times that you were the perpetrator of suffering and evil. So what do we do about all of these things? There has to be a consequence for them. Someone has to, if God is really holy and just and righteous, there has to be a payment for these things or some sort of punishment for him to be holy and just. So what's our answer to that question? So in a moment here, Brian and the worship team are going to come back out and they're going to play a song. And so if you're a believer sitting here, I just want you to kind of listen to this song, reflect on its lyrics, and kind of sit in gratitude for what God has done on our behalf in Jesus. And if you are still skeptical, I think my encouragement to you would be to consider the lyrics of this song. Consider the lyrics of this song to hear about what it is that Christians say is the way that we handle the question of, okay, what about the evil and suffering that we cause others? So everyone has an answer to the question of evil and suffering, and God's answer is Jesus. In Jesus, God takes suffering and evil upon himself. Jesus bears the punishment so that we can then go free. And if you're sitting here and you're wondering, okay, how do I receive this gift? How do I receive this gift of Jesus bearing my punishment? The way you receive it is by faith. So when you look to Jesus and you see him dying on the cross, being crucified, and if you see that when he's dying, he's bearing the punishment for the suffering and evil that you've caused others, when you see that, you can receive it by faith and it can be yours. And if it's a decision that you've made today on one of the response cards, go ahead and mark convinced on there, or that you made that decision today, and we would be more than glad to talk with you after the service about that. So if you'd stand and worship, we'll worship one more time here.